The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, sending crystal fragments across my family's dining room like tiny stars. But it wasn't the broken glass that made everyone freeze. It was the words that had just come out of my stepmother's mouth. "Oh, please, Marcus," she had laughed, her voice dripping with condescension. "You weren't fighting a real war. You were just playing soldier in some desert sandbox."
Oh.
What she didn't know was that Admiral Patricia Hernandez, the woman standing 3 feet away from her, had just watched her own son come home in a flag-draped coffin 2 months earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Marcus. Caldwell and I had been deployed in Afghanistan for 18 months with the 82nd Airborne Division. Coming home should have been the happiest day of my life. But instead, I found myself standing in the middle of what felt like a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to showcase my stepmother's idea of the perfect family reunion, Victoria. Sinclair, she kept her maiden name after marrying my father, had insisted on throwing this homecoming party. Not because she cared about my service, but because it gave her another opportunity to play hostess to Charleston's social elite. My father, Robert Caldwell, owned 3 successful car dealerships across South Carolina, which meant Victoria had access to all the right circles. And those circles loved a good patriotic story, especially when it came with expensive wine and catered hors d'oeuvres. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd planned this entire celebration around something she fundamentally didn't understand or respect. Victoria had married my father when I was 16, 2 years after my mother died from cancer. She'd never had children of her own, and she treated my military service like an extended summer camp that had inconveniently delayed my return to what she considered real life, namely, joining my father's business and settling down with someone from the country club. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Victoria had transformed our family home into something that looked like a cross between a political fundraiser and a wedding reception. Red, white, and blue bunting draped every doorway. She'd hired a photographer to capture what she kept calling Marcus's triumphant return. The guest list read like a who's who of Charleston society: local politicians, business owners, members of the yacht club, and their perfectly coiffed wives. I walked through the front door in my dress uniform, feeling more like a prop than a person. Victoria immediately swooped in, air-kissing both my cheeks while being careful not to smudge her lipstick. "You look so handsome in your costume," she whispered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Even then, she couldn't help herself. My father appeared moments later, and his embrace felt genuine. "Welcome home, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Robert Caldwell was a good man who'd built his business from nothing, but he'd always been conflict-averse, especially when it came to his wife. He'd learned to pick his battles with Victoria, and apparently, her casual dismissal of my service wasn't worth fighting over. The first hour passed in a blur of handshakes and small talk. Victoria had briefed everyone on appropriate conversation topics, steering clear of anything too heavy about war or combat. Instead, guests asked about the weather in Afghanistan, whether I'd gotten to ride camels, and if I'd brought back any souvenirs. Their questions revealed how little they understood about what military service actually entailed. But their intentions seemed harmless enough. I was talking with Judge Harold Morrison about his son's college plans when I noticed her. Admiral Patricia Hernandez stood near the French doors leading to the garden, nursing a glass of wine and observing the party with the quiet intensity of someone accustomed to command. She wore a simple black dress, and if you didn't know better, you might have mistaken her for just another society wife. But there was something in her posture, the way she held herself, that spoke of authority earned through decades of service. I excused myself from the judge and made my way over to her. "Admiral Hernandez," I said, extending my hand. "Sergeant Marcus Caldwell. It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." She turned and studied me with sharp gray eyes. "At ease, Sergeant. And congratulations on making it home safely." Her handshake was firm, professional. "Your stepmother mentioned you served with the 82nd Airborne." "Yes, ma'am. 18 months in Kandahar province." Admiral Hernandez nodded slowly. Tough deployment. Lost good people in that region. There was a weight to her words that told me she understood what I'd seen over there in ways that none of the other party guests could. We talked for a few minutes about my service, and I learned that she'd recently retired after 32 years in the Navy. She'd commanded ships, served in multiple combat zones, and had been one of the first women to achieve flag rank in her specialty. More importantly, she spoke about military service with the respect and understanding it deserved. Our conversation was interrupted when Victoria appeared with a fresh glass of champagne and a wide smile. "Admiral, I see you've met my stepson. Isn't he handsome in his little uniform?" She placed a possessive hand on my arm. "We're so proud that he's finally ready to put all this military business behind him and focus on real life." I felt my jaw tighten, but Admiral Hernandez's expression remained neutral. "Military service is quite an accomplishment," she said carefully. "Your stepson has served his country with honor."
Oh.
Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, of course. Of course. We're very grateful for his service and all that. It's just such a relief to have him back safely from his little adventure." She took a sip of champagne and continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension she was creating. "I mean, nowadays these deployments are so much safer than they used to be. It's not like World War II or anything really dangerous." The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, not for myself, but for Victoria's casual ignorance. She had no idea that the woman she was talking to had spent 3 decades in uniform, had commanded thousands of sailors, and had made life-and-death decisions in situations Victoria couldn't even imagine. "Victoria?" I said quietly. "Maybe we should," but she was just getting started. The champagne had clearly loosened her tongue, and she'd found an audience for opinions she'd apparently been holding back. "Don't get me wrong, Admiral. I have tremendous respect for our military. But let's be honest about what these modern deployments really are. It's not like Marcus was storming the beaches of Normandy or anything truly heroic like that." Admiral Hernandez set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. The small movement somehow commanded attention from everyone within earshot. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made admirals out of ordinary people. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Victoria, completely missing the warning signs, smiled brightly. "Well, I just mean that today's military service is so much easier than it used to be. All that technology and air conditioning and video games to keep them entertained. Marcus spent most of his time on a nice, safe base-playing soldier with his friends. It's really more like an extended camping trip than actual war." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Several nearby conversations stopped mid-sentence as people turned to see what was happening. I wanted to disappear, to drag Victoria away before she could say anything else. But it was too late. Admiral Hernandez straightened to her full height, and suddenly the retired flag officer was very much present in the room. "Playing soldier," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of each word. "Is that what you think military service is?" Victoria, finally sensing that something had shifted but not understanding what, nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. I mean, no disrespect to Marcus or anyone else, but let's call it what it is. These young men go overseas, they live in comfortable barracks, they get 3 meals a day, and they spend most of their time sitting around waiting for something to happen. It's hardly the same as what our grandfathers went through in real wars." That's when Admiral Hernandez did something I'll never forget. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Without saying a word, she placed it on the table next to Victoria's champagne glass. The photograph showed a young man in navy dress blues, probably around my age, with Admiral Hernandez's unmistakable gray eyes and determined jawline. He was standing on the deck of a ship, squinting into bright sunlight, with that particular smile that military families learn to treasure, the one that says everything is fine, even when it isn't. Victoria glanced down at the photo, then back up at the Admiral with a confused expression. "Oh, how nice. Is this your son? He looks very handsome in his costume, too." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Admiral Hernandez's voice, when she spoke, was steady and controlled, but there was something underneath it that made my blood run cold. That photograph was taken 3 months ago aboard the USS Charleston. Lieutenant Commander David Hernandez was leading a humanitarian mission to evacuate American civilians from a conflict zone. She picked up the photograph and held it carefully, as if it were made of the most fragile glass. 2 months ago, David's convoy hit an improvised explosive device while delivering medical supplies to a remote village. He and 3 other sailors died instantly while trying to save lives in what you might call playing soldier. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, then a creeping horror as she understood what she'd just done. Several guests had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing the shift in atmosphere without understanding its source. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Admiral turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression that made me stand straighter. "Sergeant, would you mind sharing with Mrs. Sinclair what a typical day looked like during your deployment?" I glanced around the room. More guests had gathered, drawn by the tension, though most still didn't understand what was happening. My father stood near the fireplace, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. Victoria looked like she wanted to disappear into the imported Italian marble floor. "Ma'am," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. A typical day started at 0500 with intelligence briefings about potential threats in our area of operations. We'd conduct security patrols through villages where insurgents regularly planted roadside bombs. Our job was to protect local civilians and help rebuild infrastructure that had been destroyed by years of conflict. Admiral Hernandez nodded encouragingly. "Continue." "We worked with local police to establish safe routes for children to get to school. We provided medical assistance to villagers who had no other access to health care. And yes, we engaged in combat when necessary to protect innocent people from those who wanted to harm them." Victoria was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. I realized that in all the months since my return, she'd never actually asked me what I'd done overseas. She'd been so focused on getting me to move on from military service that she'd never bothered to understand what that service had entailed. "But surely," Victoria said weakly, grasping for some way to salvage the conversation, "surely you have to admit that modern soldiers have so many advantages that previous generations didn't have. Better equipment, better communication." Admiral Hernandez's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Better equipment means that when an IED explodes under your vehicle, you might survive with traumatic brain injury instead of dying instantly. Better communication means that when your friend bleeds out in front of you, you can call for medical evacuation and listen to his family's voices on a satellite phone while you try to stop the bleeding." She stepped closer to Victoria, her presence somehow filling the entire room. "Modern warfare isn't easy, Mrs. Sinclair. It's more complex, it's more psychologically demanding, and more morally ambiguous than anything previous generations faced. These young men and women don't just fight battles, they serve as diplomats. Social workers, engineers, medics, and peacekeepers, often all on the same day." Judge Morrison appeared at my elbow, his face grave. He'd served in Vietnam and clearly understood the situation better than most of the other guests. "Perhaps we should," he began diplomatically. "No, Admiral," Hernandez said firmly. "It's important that everyone here understands exactly what military service entails, since Mrs. Sinclair seems to have such strong opinions about it." She turned back to Victoria, who was now gripping her champagne glass with both hands. "Tell me, Mrs. Sinclair, what's the most difficult decision you've ever had to make?" Victoria opened and closed her mouth several times before managing to speak. I suppose, ... Choosing between the Italian marble and the Spanish tiles for the kitchen renovation was quite stressful. The absurdity of her response hung in the air like a bad smell. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of Victoria's earlier comments. "Sergeant Caldwell," Admiral Hernandez continued, "could you tell Mrs. Sinclair about the most difficult decision you made during your deployment?" I felt my throat tighten. This wasn't a story I'd shared with anyone, not even my father. But something about Admiral Hernandez's unwavering gaze gave me the strength to speak. There was a day when our convoy came under attack while we were escorting a medical team to a village clinic. The insurgents had positioned themselves near a school, using the children as human shields. I had to decide whether to return fire and risk civilian casualties or allow them to continue their attack on the medical team. The room was completely silent now. Even the hired servers had stopped moving, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Did you do?" Victoria whispered. I called in air support to create a diversion while we flanked their position on foot. It worked, but barely. 3 children were wounded in the crossfire anyway. I still see their faces every night when I try. To sleep, Admiral Hernandez placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "That, Mrs. Sinclair, is what playing soldier looks like in the real world. Split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. Made by 20-year-olds who carry the weight of those choices for the rest of their lives," Victoria said. Down her champagne glass with shaking hands, the liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth red. I didn't realize... ... "Of course you didn't realize," Admiral Hernandez said, her voice softer now, but no less firm, "because you've never bothered to ask. You've been so busy planning Sergeant Caldwell's transition back to civilian life that you never stopped to honor what he'd already accomplished in military life." The Admiral picked up her photograph and carefully placed it back in her purse. "My son believed that military service was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He died believing that. Every person in uniform believes that, whether they're serving in combat zones or standing watch on quiet nights when nothing happens." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of Charleston's social elite, most of whom had never worn a uniform or made a sacrifice more significant than choosing between vacation destinations. "The next time any of you feel tempted to minimize military service," Admiral Hernandez said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I want you to remember that freedom isn't free. It's paid for in blood, sweat, tears, and sleepless nights by people who are willing to put their lives on the line for strangers." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Victoria stood frozen, her face cycling through shades of pale that I didn't know existed. The other guests seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this social catastrophe would resolve itself. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the 70-year-old widow of a former congressman, stepped forward. From the crowd, she walked directly to Admiral Hernandez and extended her hand. "Admiral, my late husband served in Korea," she said, her voice steady, despite her age. "He never talked much about it, but I know it changed him. I want to thank you for your service, and I'm deeply sorry for the loss of your son." Admiral Hernandez accepted the handshake with grace. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. That means more than you know." What happened next caught everyone off guard. Mrs. Whitfield turned to face Victoria, her expression stern, but not unkind. "Victoria, dear, I think you owe some apologies here. Not just to the Admiral, but to young Marcus as well." Victoria looked around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Every face was watching her, waiting. She opened her mouth several times before finally managing to speak. "Admiral Hernandez," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am profoundly sorry for what I said about your son and about military service in general. I spoke from ignorance, and there's no excuse for that." Admiral Hernandez nodded. Slowly. "Apology accepted, Mrs. Sinclair. But I'm not the only one who deserves one." Victoria turned to me, and for the first time since she'd married my father, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse in her eyes. "Marcus, I owe you the biggest apology of all. I've been dismissive of your service because I didn't understand it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "Thank you, Victoria. That means a lot." But Admiral Hernandez wasn't finished. She looked around the room at the assembled guests, her gaze lingering on each face. "Sinclair's ignorance isn't unique. Many of you have actually taken the time to understand what military service means. How many of you have asked a veteran about their experiences instead of just thanking them for their service and moving on?" Judge Morrison cleared his throat. "Admiral, if I may, what would you suggest we do differently?" Admiral Hernandez considered the question carefully. "Start by listening. Really listening. When you meet a veteran, don't just say thank you for your service and walk away. Ask them about their experiences. Learn about the missions they served on. Understand that military service isn't a career choice. It's a calling that requires sacrifice most people can't imagine. She paused, looking directly at me. And when they come home, don't rush them to get back to normal life. Military service changes people. It gives them skills, perspectives, and experiences that should be valued, not dismissed. My father, who had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. Admiral, what can we do to better support veterans in our community? Hire them, Admiral Hernandez said without hesitation. Veterans bring leadership skills, problem-solving abilities, and work ethics that are unmatched. They've been trained to operate under pressure, work as part of a team, and adapt to changing circumstances. These aren't just nice qualities to have. They're essential for success in any field. She gestured toward me. Sergeant Caldwell here has managed logistics for complex operations, led teams in high-stress situations, and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Those skills don't disappear when he takes off the uniform. Victoria, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. What kinds of careers do veterans typically pursue after their service? It was the first question she'd ever asked about military life that wasn't loaded with assumptions or dismissiveness. Admiral Hernandez seemed to recognize this and answered. Thoughtfully, veterans go into every field you can imagine. Law enforcement, business, medicine, education, technology, public service. The leadership training and discipline they receive in the military translates to success in civilian careers. She looked around the room. Many of the most successful CEOs in America are veterans. They understand how to motivate teams, manage resources, and execute complex plans under pressure. These are exactly the qualities that drive business success. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. My son's law firm specifically recruits veterans, says they make the best attorneys because they understand duty, honor, and commitment. Exactly, Admiral Hernandez agreed. But too often, civilian employers see military service as time away from real career development, instead of recognizing it as intensive leadership training. Dr. Margaret Chen, a surgeon who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward. Admiral, I served as a Navy medic before medical school. Military medical training is some of the most advanced in the world. I learned trauma surgery techniques in field hospitals that many civilian doctors never encounter. Admiral Hernandez smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. Dr. Chen, thank you for sharing that. It's a perfect example of how military experience enhances rather than detracts from civilian expertise. Victoria, who seemed to be processing everything she was hearing, asked another question. How can someone like me, who has never served, better understand and support veterans? Admiral Hernandez considered this carefully. Educate yourself. Read about military history and current operations. Volunteer with veteran support organizations. But most importantly, approach veterans with genuine curiosity rather than preconceived notions. She paused, then added, and remember that asking about their service isn't disrespectful, it's honoring. Most veterans are proud of what they've accomplished and want to share their experiences with people who genuinely want to understand. Mrs. Whitfield, who had been listening intently, addressed the entire room. I think we all learned something important tonight. Perhaps instead of planning social events around veterans, we should be planning with them. Admiral Hernandez nodded. Approvingly, Mrs. Whitfield makes an excellent point. Veterans don't want to be treated as objects of pity or charity. They want to be recognized for their capabilities and given opportunities to contribute. My father stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Marcus, we've never really talked about how your military experience might apply to the business. I'd like to change that. For the first time all evening, I felt genuinely hopeful. I'd like that too, Dad. Admiral Hernandez gathered her purse and prepared to leave. Sergeant Caldwell, it's been an honor meeting you. Your service matters. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As she walked toward the door, she turned back to address the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, the next time you see someone in uniform, remember that they've volunteered to face dangers you'll never have to think about. They've made sacrifices so you can sleep safely in your beds. That's not playing soldier. That's heroism. Victoria followed Admiral Hernandez to the door. Admiral, is there anything I can do? Any organization you support that I could contribute to? Admiral Hernandez paused, studying Victoria's face as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine. There's a scholarship fund for children of fallen service members. David's unit established it after he died. If you're serious about making amends, that would be a meaningful way to honor his memory. Please send me the information, Victoria said earnestly. It's the least I can do. After Admiral Hernandez left, the party gradually wound down. Guests lingered longer than usual, many approaching me to ask genuine questions about my service. The conversations were different from the superficial small talk earlier, deeper. More respectful, more curious. Victoria and I found ourselves alone on the garden terrace as the last guests departed. Marcus, she said quietly, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a completely fresh start. I looked at her, this woman who had been part of my family for years, but had never really tried to understand me. What do you mean? I want to learn about the man you've become, not just try to turn you into the man I think you should be. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that's all you need to build something better. The broken champagne glass had long since been cleaned up, but the changes it set in motion were just beginning. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened in our household. Victoria began researching military history with the same intensity she'd once reserved for planning charity galas. She read books about Afghanistan, watched documentaries about veteran experiences, and even attended a local support group meeting. For military families, her transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, it was gradual and genuine. She started asking me thoughtful questions about my deployment, not to critique or minimize, but to truly understand. When I mentioned nightmares, she researched PTSD resources. When I talked about the camaraderie I missed, she helped me connect with other veterans in Charleston. The scholarship fund Admiral Hernandez had mentioned became Victoria's new passion project. She organized a fundraising gala that raised over $50,000 in its first year. But more importantly, she insisted that the event honor fallen service members by sharing their stories, not just collecting donations. My father, meanwhile, began restructuring his business to actively recruit veterans. He created a mentorship program pairing military veterans with experienced civilian employees. Recognizing that the transition from military to civilian work required more than just good intentions, the ripple effects extended throughout Charleston's social circles. Mrs. Whitfield organized a monthly dinner series where veterans could share their experiences with community leaders. Judge Morrison's law firm started offering pro bono legal services to veterans dealing with bureaucratic challenges. Chen began volunteering at the VA hospital, training civilian medical staff in trauma techniques she'd learned during her military service. Her work bridged the gap between military and civilian healthcare, improving outcomes for veterans and civilians alike. 6 months after the party, Admiral Hernandez returned to Charleston for the Scholarship Fund Gala. The transformation in Victoria was immediately apparent to her. For once there had been dismissive ignorance, there was now genuine respect and understanding. Mrs. Sinclair, Admiral Hernandez, said during their conversation that evening, "You've honored my son's memory more than you know. David would have appreciated seeing his story used to educate others rather than simply mourned." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Admiral, I can never undo the words I spoke that night. But I hope I can spend the rest of my life making sure no other military family ever feels dismissed or diminished by my ignorance." As for me, the homecoming party that had started as such a disaster became the catalyst for the life I'd always wanted, but never knew how to ask for. My father and I developed a genuine partnership in the business. With him respecting my military leadership experience and me appreciating his decades of business wisdom, the nightmares didn't disappear overnight. But having a support system that understood their significance made them easier to bear. Victoria connected me with a therapist who specialized in veteran issues. And slowly, I began processing experiences I'd bottled up for too long. A year later, I stood in the same dining room where Victoria had once called my service playing soldier. This time we were hosting a different kind of gathering, a reunion for members of my unit who had also returned home. Victoria had organized the entire event, But instead of treating us like curiosities to be displayed, she facilitated meaningful conversations between veterans and community members. Admiral. Hernandez's photograph of her son now sat framed on our mantelpiece, not as a reminder of grief, but as a symbol of sacrifice honored and remembered. Beside it was a photo of my own unit. Taken during our final mission in Afghanistan, the two images together told a story about service, loss, understanding, and ultimately healing. They reminded everyone who entered our home that freedom comes at a cost, and that cost should never be minimized or forgotten. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but in living rooms and dining rooms where ignorance encounters truth and prejudice meets understanding. The victory that night wasn't won through superior firepower or a tactical advantage. It was won through the quiet courage of speaking truth to ignorance and the willingness to listen when truth is spoken. Victoria never became a military expert, but she became something more valuable, an advocate who understood that supporting veterans meant more than empty platitudes and patriotic decorations. She learned that true support required genuine effort. To understand experiences vastly different from her own, the homecoming party I dreaded became the foundation for relationships I treasured. It proved that even the most painful confrontations can lead to genuine growth when people approach each other with honesty, humility, and a willingness to change. Admiral Hernandez was right. Military service isn't playing soldier. It's about real people making real sacrifices for principles larger than themselves. But civilian life isn't playing house either. It's about building communities strong enough to support those who've sacrificed for them. In the end, we all learned that bridging the civilian-military divide doesn't require grand gestures or perfect understanding. It requires simple things: asking genuine questions, listening to honest answers, and recognizing that every person's service, whether in uniform or out, contributes to something larger than themselves. The champagne stain on the tablecloth never completely came out, despite Victoria's best efforts with expensive cleaning services. She eventually decided to keep it as a reminder that some mistakes leave permanent marks, but those marks don't have to define the future. Sometimes they can serve as touchstones for growth, change, and redemption. And sometimes the most powerful victories are won not through conflict, but through the courage to admit when you're wrong and the commitment to do better. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.